Good morning and welcome back. Happy to see everybody here for what should be a wonderful conversation about an unbelievable time in women's football coming out of the stellar, in every way, 2023 Women's World Cup. You have their bios, but let me briefly introduce our panelists. Next to me, James Johnson, the head of the Australian Federation, and like me, a Boston University Terrier. Happy to hear. Thanks for joining us. Beck Smith, who's going to represent the Ferns and talk New Zealand and everything else from an exciting tournament where they got their big first win. That was fantastic. And on the end, we have Freya Coombe, former manager at Gotham and Angel City, who over the summer in Sydney analyzed the World Cup for Fox Sports and the BBC, and then went on to work for CBS the rest of the NWSL season. And I'm sure he'll be back coaching soon, and maybe he'll break a little news up here of what you're doing next. Maybe after a couple drinks in the bar tonight. So anyway, well, thank you so much for everybody joining us. It's a really exciting topic, obviously, coming out of the World Cup, to talk a little bit of a look back at what happened this summer, and then where we go from there in the women's game in general, but also upcoming events as well. So let's start off by just a quick look back. Tell us kind of about your takeaways from the tournament, just from 30,000 feet. You want to start with?
Sure. So we were very...
Yeah, do we have James' mic?
We were...
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we were very happy to host the...
Yeah, I don't think we have James, guys. So while we're waiting to get James fixed, Bex, we'll move on to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather hear James's view on it, but I'll take it then. Is yours on? Is it on, James? As the CEO of a football federation, you have to have your mic on even. No, I thought some of the takeaways from the Women's World Cup were amazing. Obviously, we saw more audiences, and you'll talk about that probably from a broadcast perspective too. So I was hosting the morning show for Optus down there, and one of the interesting stats was that they said that on average, each of the subscribers watched 21 hours of the tournament, which is almost a day. So that means each person that was a subscriber, and not only that, but it was shifted from like 50-50 watching on TV and small tablets to 75% were watching on TVs, which just actually goes to show that a lot of people were watching it together as families or as groups. So it's a big community vibe, and you could see that in the statistics and data. And that is sort of one of the reasons why we all probably work in the women's game, was because the audience is more diverse, it's more inclusive. We have a really nice way of sort of including people. And we saw that in New Zealand, which was a country that is a rugby cricket country. We saw that even after the football Ferns bowed out in the first, in the group stage, which no one's going to be talking about on stage or ever again, probably. But that we saw that New Zealand fans still came out. They had big crowds in some of the stadiums in Dunedin, which, does anyone know even where Dunedin is? No, exactly. So yeah, I think that finally the swell of women's football has shown that actually it was amazing. And it was down under, which was an entire day to get to from Europe. So not surprising for any of us on stage, but I think for the world it was pretty eye-opening how amazing and popular it was globally.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And Freya, you want to give us your kind of thoughts for the first time doing media at a World Cup?
Yeah, it was my first time as a broadcaster, and I was blown away by the sheer investment of Fox, particularly with the setup that we had. We had 3 sets right downtown in Sydney, and just a little production village, and I'd never really seen the behind the scenes before, so I wasn't sure what I was expecting. But it was a sheer massive undertaking, and then just seeing how much the country got behind the game and how much they got behind Australia in particular was just incredible. And walking through Sydney, and how just as they progressed through the competition, just the sheer excitement for Sydney. You can feel the hustle and bustle, and especially being an England fan, when England came into town, it was like the amount of England fans everywhere. The shirts selling out in the Nike store, it was just a huge undertaking, and it was like, this is what a World Cup feels like. This isn't a Women's World Cup, this is a World Cup now. And it was fantastic. Yeah, and Bex was asking me backstage, when the US went out, say, what did you guys do? So when the US went out, what was that like? Yeah, it was a huge surprise for me, actually. It was like the US went out, which was disappointing, and obviously being an American broadcaster, just the players, ex-players that were on the team and on the panel were just so devastated but the show went on and it didn't miss a beat in terms of the number of shows and the investment that carried on. And you could see that, just by continuing it, it was like there still was the big audiences watching back home. There was still the investment of people like getting behind it. And then just with Australia as well, now starting to follow Australia and starting to follow the English teams was just huge. And that was really good to see, is that everyone stayed and we still did the same number of shows, same number of hours. It was brilliant.
I don't think Karina LeBlanc, the Canadian player, was that devastated though that the US went out, right?
She went running through the set. She was pretty happy about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely, I can assure you that definitely happened. We've got a handheld for James.
All right.
Hey, welcome to the party,
Welcome,
James.
welcome.
Party. Great
Saving
to
the
be
best
here.
for last.
Look, we're very happy as a co-host to have hosted the biggest and best ever Women's World Cup. When we went into the tournament, we set really ambitious KPIs, both on the broadcast and also the attendance areas. On the attendance areas, we hit nearly 2 million attendees across Australia and New Zealand, 1.98, 400,000 of those attendees went to the 7 Matildas matches, which was really important for us in Australia. And to put that into perspective, the Women's World Cup in 2019 in France, the total numbers was about 1.1, 1.2 million. So to get to 2 million attendance was phenomenal. We're very excited about that. Broadcast was also interesting. 2 billion was the total reach in the end, and that's compared to about 1.1 billion in France just 4 years earlier. And there were some really great stories within that 2 billion from our time zone. The China versus the England match, there was 54 million people in China that tuned into that match. When we played against the Lionesses in the semi-final, more than half of the population of Australia tuned in and watched, and that's the biggest TV program, sport or otherwise, that's ever been broadcast in Australia. So we're very proud. On reflection, we're very happy we hit broadcast in attendance, and we're happy to have co-hosted the biggest ever Women's World Cup.
And it just built. So when you embed in a World Cup, you're there for about 6 weeks and you're in a hotel all together. And one of the most important people in your life becomes your concierge. So we had this concierge named Colin where we stayed. And I love to talk to Colin because what you would do is at the beginning, he was like your window into Australia. And at the beginning, he was a rugby guy and not really into football. And so we had to kind of tell him what was going on and all that. By the end, when I'd go down to talk to Colin, he was, when is Sam Kerr going to be back? What's going on with the team? He wanted everything. And that's what we saw happen in Australia and New Zealand, was just it grow. Can you talk about from the beginning to the end how, thanks a lot to the Matildas, of course, on the field, but it really took off in market?
Yeah, the way we looked at it leading in is we needed 2 key ingredients. One was to deliver a great tournament, but the other was the performance of the Matildas on the pitch. And for me, having those 2 ingredients and getting those 2 ingredients to work well together was what was going to create tournament magic. So we had to do a lot of changes. The Matildas had historically arguably not performed well at Women's World Cups. So we had to bring in a new coach, a coach that had been to World Cup finals, won World Cups, won Olympics. We put in place a really strong schedule. The Matildas played every single top 10 nation in the lead up to the Women's World Cup. So we really needed to condition the team to what they were going to expect when we got to the Women's World Cup. So for me, the periods that really elevated the level, number one was the opening matches. New Zealand and Australia won their opening matches. It really set the tone and create a lot of interest locally. The second was when the Matildas had a must-win match against Canada in the group stage. That was where it really elevated to another level. And I think the third turning point, again, with the local hosts, was the round of 8 when Australia played France, 20 penalties, high broadcast numbers. It set up the semi-final that a lot of people wanted, which was Australia and England. So for me, it was a mixture of delivering the tournament, but also the hosts performing, which I think really elevated the competition and brought out that magic that we saw in the tournament.
Okay, so there's a lot of people here from federations, confederations, different people that will be involved in hosting events going forward. You guys are obviously looking to bring others in, maybe the Asian Cup down the road. Looking back, what would you have done differently? What kind of advice would you have to people who are looking to run an event coming up? What did you learn from it that people here watching can learn from you?
One of the learnings for us is a relationship between broadcast numbers and attendances. In Australia, we always can sell tickets. It doesn't matter what the event is, Australians will show up and buy tickets. So we knew that we would get high attendances. So what we really needed to do was ensure that the match schedule, and in particular the timings of the matches, was really tailored for the international broadcast audience. And we're actually in a great time zone, so we tried to really utilize 5 different time zones. Perth to Auckland, there's 5 hours difference. So when it came to kickoff times, we knew that if we played at midday or at 9 p.m, we would have people that would come to games. So we really tried to structure our kickoff times to suit the broadcast audience around the world. Perth, if you play in the evenings, you're reaching early mid-afternoon in London and in Paris. If you play at prime time in Sydney, you're in the same time zone in prime time in Beijing and Tokyo. And if you play in Auckland in the mid-afternoon, you're reaching the East Coast, New York, Miami, at a good time as well in prime time. So we think we got that balance right. We had full stadiums, but we also over-delivered on the broadcast numbers, and that was a learning for us, getting the time right and making sure that relationship between attendance and broadcast works properly.
Fantastic, makes a lot of sense. Let's dive into on the field, because there was a ton of chatter about the football in this tournament being so much better, frankly, than it was in 19, as the women's game continues to grow around the world, especially here in the US, but around the world as well. So let's talk about that. Bex, what did you see? Was the football that much better than 19? Are we seeing that growth in the game?
Yeah, massive. And I think just back to the question you just asked James about the tournament, how it was pre-created and supported. I think what Australia and New Zealand did really well is they were expecting the big crowds. So it's that we were talking about it earlier, if you build it, they will come. We know where the women's game is. Those of us that have coached and played and know the players and watch on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis on the local level. And 2 years ago, I was the venue director for UEFA at Benfica, which is obviously the club in Portugal, and watching the investment that they were doing 2-3 years ahead of the World Cup, and then watching Portugal come to the tournament and absolutely smash it. And the US women's national team can thank that left post that it was there, because otherwise Portugal would have knocked out the US from the group stage. And watching that, I think we've seen the development on a local level so well. But what the tournament did so well is they planned for the big crowds. They put in the marketing spend, they put in the efforts. They knew that there was going to be a lot to come, because we knew that the quality on the pitch has grown so much in the last 4 years. It's unbelievable. But that's down to federations, clubs. A lot of the clubs are driving the development of the sport right now as well. And things like Champions League. So the centralization of the UEFA Women's Champions League 2-3 years ago, that was a massive investment to make sure that all of those games from the group stage are actually developing those players in club level day in, day out. And that's what we need. We need that quality on the base, which you've worked with very closely, to increase so much, so that when the national teams come together, which is very rare, that they absolutely smash it. And that's exactly what they did. So I think that the expansion of the tournament, I was worried about before, but actually watching those debut teams, some of them were some of the best teams to watch. Haiti was one of my favorite teams to watch. South Africa was one of my favorite teams to watch. Portugal I thought was amazing. So I'm not surprised that it's grown, but you had that investment is from tens of years, decades of years of investment into the game.
Portugal's a really interesting one, because Portugal came in late. They qualified actually in New Zealand when they played against Cameroon, but they're a team that wouldn't have got in unless the field had been expanded. And they came in and they played well. I think they surprised everyone. And I was on a call actually with their coach Francisco Neto and one of the assistant coaches from the US team the other day. And they said that the US said that Portugal was the team that they were most worried about, because they have just seen the growth in the team. But Portugal is still coming from a league where only 2 teams are professional in that league, and I think that's the growth where it's going to come. Is you've seen the changes and the level up that they've had from just having 2 teams that are professional, and now most of the players play in those 2 teams. But now for the league to become professional, I think that's where you're going to see them increase and become even better, and that's where the investment, the resources, the investment into coaches as well. And we've seen from the games that we saw, the tactical flexibility that we're now seeing from coaches in tournaments. We saw it with England and Serena Wegman when they changed. Kira Walsh was down injured, they changed to a 3-5-2, which we probably haven't seen that before in major tournaments. Teams have stuck to their guns, and Serena's always played a 4-3-3, and then now she's changed it. Or looking at Japan when they had their mammoth game against Spain, and they completely changed their tactics for that game. They went very much in terms of counter-attacking, and we haven't seen that before in different World Cups where you've seen so much tactical flexibility, and that's coming from the investment of great coaches that are coming in to work with those players, with the investment of sports science, the analytics that are going into it, and because of that investment, I think we're seeing the increase of the product on the field.
Yeah, we were talking, you mentioned Karina LeBlanc, our friend Karina LeBlanc, a former Canadian international who did television for Fox, GM of the Portland Thorns now. We were talking during the tournament about how much the goalkeeping has come along, and just it's completely different position right now in the women's game than it was in recent World Cups for sure. Is that just down to what you're talking about, just having proper training, proper investment, and is that what we need to keep?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always looked at the majority of what the game is, which is the 11 aside, the 10 players that are out on the pitch. But areas that we haven't really looked at because we haven't had the capacity to, or let's say the luxury to in the women's game, are areas like goalkeeping. So when I was playing 1,000 years ago, Germany was really the only team that had a professional goalkeeping coach that came from the men's side. So former German player sitting there right there, who played with Silke Rottenberg. But some of the best goalkeeping we saw in Germany. Refereeing was another area that we just haven't looked at. So when I first came into FIFA, again, about 7-8 years ago, there was no female or no one that was running the women's refereeing department. So we created that whole area and scope with quite a lot of arm twisting by Massimo, but trying to increase the women's refereeing, because if the game is going here and the refereeing is staying here, you're still not going to increase the game. So there's a lot of technical areas where we've been able to have the luxury now to invest in and look at, because we've gotten the 10 outfield players right.
Yeah, and Mary Earps is a great example from England, shortlisted for Player of the Year, received the Player of the Year award in England. Obviously there was, a real demand for her jersey. Everyone was, furious that they couldn't buy her jersey, and I think that's the rise of goalkeeper, and without her in the team, like, England would have really struggled. She saved their ass a number of times, so, I think that role has become so important, and that's where we've seen a huge increase.
Yeah, we were talking, you mentioned Karina LeBlanc, our friend Karina LeBlanc, a former Canadian international who did television for Fox, GM of the Portland Thorns now. We were talking during the tournament about how much the goalkeeping has come along, and just it's completely different position right now in the women's game than it was in recent World Cups for sure. Is that just down to what you're talking about, just having proper training, proper investment, and is that what we need to keep?
Without
the
washing
Lionesses?
it too. The luck was in the jersey. I couldn't wash it. When we started winning, I couldn't wash it. So I really do think that's why we got to the final.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, by the way, we could tell. She's not lying. So let's talk about New Zealand for a second. Historic first win, led of course by Angel City captain Ali Riley. A little shout out for her.
Yeah.
I mean, how big was that, and how does that come to be? Because it's not just home field advantage. It doesn't mean you're going to win a match.
Yeah. Do you know, I think a lot of what happened on that opening match with the Football Ferns, which was played in Auckland, was the fact that it was at Eden Park, which is a really historic venue in New Zealand, and there was a lot of talk ahead of the tournament, I'm sure, about which stadiums do you use. We saw the Women's Euros in England 2-3 years ago. When was that? 2 years ago?
Yeah, last year.
It feels like it. Was it last year? Last year. Obviously, it was only last year. But there's a lot of talk about some of those stadiums being too small. And what I think New Zealand did well is they picked, the big stadiums for the big events. So having a full stadium at Eden Park was massively helpful, because they never had that before. The Kiwis, every time we played in New Zealand, there were about 10 people. A couple of them were my parents and the dog from the neighbors. And so I think that was the main thing. And so I think the fans really lifted them, because we saw after that, the second and third game, their performance dipped quite a lot, so very unfortunately. But again, back to the investment in how do you get fans, which is a rugby, cricket, netball nation, to come and watch women's football. And a lot of that was down to the marketing of the tournament and also the co-hosts, because I think from the swell from Australia and the Matildas and how well they do and how big Sam Kerr is, I think really helped over the channel as well in New Zealand.
Not a bad run for the Matildas. No Sam Kerr, no problem, huh?
Yeah, no problem, and it's a good point. When we recruited our head coach, Tony Gustafsson, we actually said to him, we want you to plan for games without Sam Kerr. We felt at the time that Sam was very dominant in the team, and previous coaches had really built the team around Sam. So when I received the phone call on the eve of our first match, I was upset, of course, but I was also comforted that we had a backup plan. And the team was ready to perform without Sam. And I think the team succeeded without her, and we knew if we could get her back at the back end of the tournament, she'd come in with fresh legs and be an asset at the back end of the tournament, and she was. So it worked out okay in the end.
Yeah, worked out okay. So you both mentioned that there was a lot of talk about the expanded field coming into this World Cup and what that would mean. Would there be a lot of 13-0 scores? Alex Morgan spraining her pinky from so many goals. Didn't happen at all. It seemed like it was really a testament to the tournament. You talked about some of the great stories that came from it and how competitive most of the matches were when we thought there might be less of that. So now as we look ahead to 27, looking at the tournament, good number of teams. Are we ready to expand in another 4 years, or what do you think about the field going forward?
I think for me it's a great number right now. I think the expanded field was fantastic, but I think we need to make sure that the teams that are now competing at this level need to make sure that their infrastructure is in place, their funding is in place, they're paying the players in the right way that they need to, and they need to get that level right before they then increase it and give that opportunity to others. But I thought it was a really good number of teams, and we didn't see the big score lines run up compared to, where we thought we were maybe in 2019. I think other than the 7-0 Netherlands, that was the biggest scoreline that we saw, and that was a very good Dutch team. But if we look at some of the biggest scorelines, Japan, Spain is right up there, and Spain went on to win. So yeah. I don't think it's necessarily about the quality of where a team is coming from. It's more about the quality of what's happening on the field.
Bex, more games, more teams means more games, means more money.
Yeah.
So there's going to be pressure to expand the tournament.
Why do you think they did it to begin with then?
Yeah.
I don't think actually when we look at when they made that decision, I don't think the women's game was ready for the expansion, if I'm really honest. I think what we got was a lot of things that combined to make it that actually they didn't do that poorly. I know James probably disagrees because he liked the more money rolling into his pockets at the Federation, and rightly so, because they invested quite a lot. But I do think that there's a big difference between playing 3 games in a group and actually getting on and playing 4 or 5 and all the way to 7. And there's only a handful of teams that can play 7 games at that quality all the way to the end and actually make it quality football. So even you could see some of those debutante teams in the third match, the quality of the match was a lot less than it was in the first match because they're not used to it. They're not used to having that in their legs. So I think it was good. I think the expansion was great. I was really impressed by the debutante teams. But again, back to Freya's point, they need to keep investing because to be able to play in a tournament over 7 games, that's a heavy load. And I can tell you after our group games that when we always went out, I was bittersweet because I was kind of happy that I could go home and didn't have to play anymore because they're tough.
Yeah, just Bex and I are former colleagues, and usually we agree on this one. We have a slightly different view. Look, we were very supportive of the expansion from 24 to 32 teams, and I think FIFA got that decision right for 2 reasons. One, competition format. 32 it's a perfect competition format. It's clear, it's easy to understand. 64 matches, it's neat and tidy. And secondly, with the quality, if we look at it objectively, the margin, the average goal difference margin actually went down in 2023 vis-a-vis 2019, and the number of matches that were ties actually increased. And these are 2 indicators of better competitiveness within the competition. So there's actually more competition in 2023 than there was in 2019 on those measurements. I think the other thing that was interesting from our perspective as the hosts was we love the fact the Women's World Cup had teams from Asia, from North America, from Europe and South America that can all legitimately win competitions. What we saw in 2023 was a real rise of Africa. 3 African teams got to round of 16, made it even more interesting, and that's something that I'm very excited about in the 2027 edition.
So in the last few minutes we have, I want to talk a little bit about legacy of these events and going forward. I'm told I'm in the ownership group of an MLS team and an NWSL team. We've got the 26 Men's World Cup coming here, potentially the 27 or 31 Women's, and I'm told that our sport, our teams, our leagues are going to explode after World Cup. I want to talk about what that means. So there was an exec from one of the top club teams, women's club teams in France, who talked about after 2019, they did not see a bump in the sport there as much as they thought they would at all, sponsorship-wise, popularity, other things. She talked about how there wasn't perhaps enough investment in the tournament going in. I can tell you, having done the World Cup in France, you could walk down the Champs-Élysées, you would not have known the tournament was going on. You couldn't buy merchandise anywhere. They weren't ready. Or, whatever the reason was, you didn't know what was going on. Not the case in Sydney. Stuff everywhere, brilliant, people walking around, fantastic atmosphere. So with that being the case, can you talk about how you are using that and what it's going to mean for the sport in Australia? You can talk about Legacy 23, I believe it's called.
Yeah, look, everyone has a different purpose for bidding, and when we bid for the Women's World Cup, the purpose was to create legacy. The day after we won the bid, we started to talk about what legacy meant, and if there's anyone that ever wants to write a book on this stuff, you should do it, because I can tell you that it doesn't exist. We looked for it. We had to define what we meant by legacy. We released Legacy 23 2.5 years before a ball was kicked, and what it meant for us was, number one, we wanted to elevate the level of the Women's World Cup for FIFA and for world football. We felt a duty to do that. We wanted to build one of the strongest sporting brands in the country in the Matildas. We've done that because they're the most valuable sporting brand national team in the country at the moment. We wanted to grow our participation base, particularly young girls, because we saw it as a big growth corridor, and we're anticipating that our base will rise by 20% in the next grassroots season. And we wanted the government at federal and state level to come to the table and invest in community infrastructure so we could enable the growth of participants. And by the end of the tournament, we had about nearly $500 million of investment for more grass, more fields, more lights, and gender-neutral changing facilities that we believe sets us up to take advantage of the growth of participants. So for us, legacy is something that was achieved, and we're living that vision today.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So we talk a lot about investment in the game. Everybody says, oh, you have to invest first, and then if you build it, they will come. We think we've done that with Angel City. There's a lot of other examples of where that's starting to happen. Kansas City Current, building the first, purpose-driven for women's football club stadium, and it looks absolutely amazing. They're going after first-class facilities and everything like that. So if you're given money and we say, oh, we have to invest, what does that mean, Bex and Freya? Where should the money be going? If you're running a club and I hand you $100 million, what do you do with it? What does that actually mean?
Well, I'm a coach, so I'm going to think about what's going to make me
Coach's
look the best.
lounge.
Yeah.
Coach, yeah.
With the bar.
Coffee machine.
Coffee, yeah.
No, for me, it's about attracting great players and bringing in the top players. I definitely need to spend the money there, because that's who people want to see. They want to see the top players, but then it's also about the facility that you put the game on. I watched the USL men's final on Sunday, and the facility there, the field really suffered. It didn't come across great on camera, and I think that putting the team on with the great players in a great facility is going to make a big difference, and I think infrastructure, as Kansas City Current are doing, is a huge part of it.
I mean, to answer your question, I'd probably go with like a legacy and where would you invest, and I think the legacy of this Women's World Cup, as well as where you would invest, is really that football is all about life lessons. So that's the reason why I'm in it. That's the reason why I think women's football is the best product out on the market. compared to what's out there, because the values and the proposition that it offers is very unique. The diversity and inclusion of the audience means that it becomes a wider audience base, and that you get more like a range in ages from young to old, from, you know, we don't have a lot of homophobia, racism, those types of issues that you have in the men's game as well. And I do think that what we've seen in the legacy of the Women's World Cup is also in the final game what happened, because I think it's worth mentioning that this is a topic, you know, where the president of the Spanish team kissed one of the players, Jenny Hermoso. It was sexual harassment, and he's not in football for at least the next couple of years, which arguably is not the right decision. But I think that these topics exist for women all around the planet, and it's not a women's issue, it's also a male education issue. So bringing to light those kinds of issues through football, being able to remedy them, fix them, show how we can actually bring them to light and make the world a better place. I think the social and cultural impact of football is really the biggest legacy that we have, specifically on the women's side, and that for me was the most important takeaway of this Women's World Cup.
Fantastic. Well, as you've heard, it's an unbelievable time in the women's game. If you're invested in it, thank you, invest more. If you're thinking about it, I can't tell you how much opportunity there is, and frankly, 10 cents on the dollar in a lot of ways to get into it now. So get into it now before it's too late, I promise you, because it's exploding and you won't be able to afford it like this for much longer. Thank you for being such good hosts. If you haven't been to Australia, put even higher on the bucket list, an unbelievable place to spend 6 weeks. You guys, congrats on an unbelievable event. Bex and Freya, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great Soccerex. Thank you, everybody.